So my friend Sue and I are drinking 2-for-1 margaritas here on the beach in La Paz, and things are very affordable in Mexico, especially if you're coming from the United States or even Canada. But sometimes what you can afford to do is not something that the government thinks that you can afford to do. And that's what we're talking about in this video, is the difference between what's affordable in Mexico and what is legally the requirements, the financial requirements for getting your residency in Mexico. This is my friend Sue here, and she is a personal concierge for extranjeros or expats or foreigners or immigrants, whatever you want to call yourself, people not from Mexico that want to establish themselves in Mexico, and she's here in La Paz. So she's going to be kind of sharing this conversation with us. First off, we're going to talk about what things cost, like what do these margaritas cost us. Then we're going to be talking about what the government wants you to have as income. And then we're going to talk about a couple ways if those things don't match for you. Say your income isn't high enough, like you can afford the margaritas, but the government is like, oh, you need more cash in your pocket before we'll let you have them. We'll tell you a couple ways around that. And then lastly, we're going to finish up with, if all of that doesn't work out for you, where are some countries that you could move to, some recommendations there. So let's jump in here and start with the conversation about costs.
So first off, I'd like to share a bit of my personal experience. So I've just decided to rent an apartment on my own here for the first time. And for me to find a one-bedroom with a tiny den, fully furnished apartment here in La Paz is costing me 20,000 pesos. Now 20,000 pesos, including utilities, is about 1,600 Canadian dollars. In Calgary right now, which is a very expensive place to live in Canada, it would cost me about $2,200 for something similar. We used to think in Canada that you could get a really cheap living in Mexico, but it's not nearly as cheap as I used to think it was.
Sue did tell me where she's living. So she's living in a nicer neighborhood in La Paz, and this is something to think about as we have this conversation. And we're going to compare La Paz, which is kind of a, it's a destination along the beach, beautiful beaches. So it's a desirable place to live, but it's not like Cabo or Cancun, one of the areas that's really become, those areas that are super tourist destinations. So also there are different parts of La Paz that you could live in. You could live somewhere much less expensive, you could live somewhere much more expensive, but we're just sharing folks' personal experience. But let's talk about other things here with Sue, other costs that she experiences.
So things have changed here a lot since I've been here. I've been here for 8.5 years. And when I first came, I could go to Bandido's, one of my favorite hamburger places, and we could have each of us a hamburger and fries, and each of us have a drink. I would have a wine, my husband would have a beer, and it would cost us under 350 pesos. Now to have that same meal in that same restaurant, and it's going to cost us over 750. So things have more than doubled as far as food goes at some of the restaurants in town.
And then when you add in the exchange rate, so probably 8 years ago, we might be in a similar exchange rate, but when we got here at the height of the pandemic, the exchange rate was very much in favor of people from the United States or even Canada. And now the exchange rate has shifted more to be in favor of Mexicans. Things change, so I'm going to be putting up numbers on the screen, but you always have to check the current exchange rate. Even when we start talking about residency, the Mexican government sets the residency in pesos. Like, what is your financial requirement? It's in pesos. So over a year, it could change by 10% or so in terms of how many dollars you need to be able to move here. And same thing with your margaritas. They're going to be set at one cost in pesos, and whether that exchange rate is up or down, that's going to impact your cost. So let me give you an example. So actually, I'm going to be doing a video about the peso. Someone commented on a video and they said something like, oh, would you move to Mexico? Would you still move to Mexico if the peso and the dollar were equal? So 1 peso was $1. Currently it's like 17 pesos equals $1. And I was like, wow, okay, that would mean that like a margarita would be like $100. That's really expensive. But what's more likely is it will either be in the 15 pesos to $1 or the 20 pesos to $1. That's kind of like the range that we can expect for the next number of years. But I'm going to be doing a video specifically about all those numbers, like what would happen to costs. And I think it was something like add about 10 pesos per dollar, like a cost of a margarita or something might be starting to become the same or more expensive in Mexico. But let me dig up some numbers here. So yes, I looked it up, and it is 10 pesos to $1. That's the point at which a margarita would be more expensive in Mexico than it is in Portland, Oregon, where I'm from. And this is a good time to talk about where you're coming from, because if you're coming from San Diego, La Paz is going to seem dirt cheap, but if you're coming from Moscow, Idaho, it may not seem that inexpensive. And this is great because Sue is a Canadian, so let's have her kind of address the idea of comparisons and apples to apples, oranges to oranges.
So I came here from Calgary in about 2015. And in 2015, things were between a quarter and a third the cost in Calgary was what you would pay here for it in Mexico. But today, if you go to numbeo.com, it's a great website for making comparisons between a variety of cities. It will tell you that if I want to buy a cappuccino here in La Paz, it's going to cost me about the equivalent of $3.50 Canadian. But in Calgary, it would cost me $5.22. That is no longer a third to a quarter. It's more like just over half. So there's quite a difference now compared to 8 years ago.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing when you look at just 3-4 years ago when we moved here, that things have become more expensive, and I think things have become more expensive everywhere, but it seems like maybe inflation in Mexico is higher, plus the exchange rate has become less favorable for foreigners. But let's pull up Numbeo and look at some of the numbers for different places so we can do some comparisons.
So, for example, if you go to Numbeo, you'll see that there are differences in rent prices between one place and another. For example, in San Diego, our prices here are about 72% lower here for rent than it would be in San Diego. However, if you go to other places in Mexico, it can be less expensive still. We are 110% of the price of a rent in Culiacan, for example. So there are places that you can go other than La Paz that would be maybe a little bit less expensive. La Paz is a wonderful place and I love it here. This is where I always want to live. But if you were to go somewhere else on the mainland of Mexico, you might find something less expensive. Same thing with buying a house. People say, oh, I can get a place for cheaper in my hometown of Boise, Idaho than I can in La Paz. Well, when I came to La Paz 8 years ago, I bought a 3-bedroom, 3-story house for $160,000 US. This year, I've got it on the market for $520,000. So prices have gone up significantly in the last 8 years. Much of that is just in the last 2.
So you're thinking half price rents down in Culiacan. One thing to mention is Culiacan is the home of El Chapo and his sons, and so it can be. Maybe
there are reasons.
Yeah, so there's some reasons, but you can go to rural parts of Mexico that maybe are more safe, that also are less expensive, but you're just not going to have some of the amenities that people from the U.S. or Canada are used to or want to have. So the reason I threw that comparison in was to see, I was like, okay, what's a spot that's going to be really cheap? Oh yeah, where El Chapo's from. So there are options out there, but let's look at another place. Kat and I were just in the car listening to murder podcasts. So I pulled up some numbers from Moscow, Idaho. So I'm going to ask Sue to read off those numbers there, comparison-wise.
You're looking at 56% less for a meal in an inexpensive restaurant here compared to Moscow, Idaho. You're also looking at about 40% less for a meal somewhere like McDonald's. If you're looking at imported beer, it's only 23% of the cost here in La Paz as it would be there. However, if you're looking for a jug of milk, you're going to pay 61% more for milk here than you would back in Idaho, where they probably make the milk.
Yes, they might make the milk in Idaho, and also I am not sure if Moscow, Idaho is any more safe than where El Chapo is from. So, but no, nothing bad about either of those two places. Bad things happen everywhere. But yeah, I think that was surprising to me to see that milk was so much more expensive. It's more expensive here in La Paz than it is in San Diego, but and also more expensive here than Culiacan in other parts of Mexico, because here in La Paz, we're near the tip of the peninsula. We kind of act like an island. So a lot of goods that are shipped over from the mainland do cost more here. So depending on where you're moving in Mexico, the cost of goods will be different. So check out Numbeo. It's not a perfect system, but it is a pretty good, it's a good way to get a good idea of what things are going to cost comparatively.
So this here margarita, if you want to buy a margarita that's like this with as much alcohol as this one has in it, let me tell you, it's powerful. You're probably going to be looking at probably around the $20 mark, maybe even more. Here, it costs us 200 pesos, which is about $12 or $13 Canadian. So there are significant differences between Calgary and here. But ranging the website that we looked at, between $6.15 and $12.20 across the United States for this kind of margarita. So when you come across the border and you get that visitor's visa card that comes with it. That gives you the right to stay here for up to 6 months, usually. Now, if you fly in on a plane, they give you 6 months. However, it gives you the ability to be here and to walk around freely, which is great. You could even buy a piece of property here if you wanted to with that visa. However, it doesn't mean you'll be able to stay here and use it. So every 6 months, you need to leave the country and then try to re-enter. And sometimes you get in again with another 6-month visa, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes they'll only give you a week. Sometimes they'll give you 2 weeks or 3 months. So you've got to be very careful about depending on that visitor visa as your ability to stay in the country. It's legal, but it doesn't mean you're guaranteed to be able to get it the next time you come back in. There's temporary residency, which you have to renew every year for up to 4 years, and then you can convert it to a permanent residency, or you can have permanent residency, which is almost the equivalent to being a citizen. You're able to own property, you're able to own a bank account, you're able to do so many things. You can't vote, but you can do so many other things.
So part of me wants to move to Alabama solely for the margarita price, but still, this regular size margarita in La Paz is still going to be a little bit cheaper than even in Alabama. And no connection at all to Alabama, but you'll notice I'm wearing a different hat. I'm not wearing my normal raggedy hat, because some people have commented on how raggedy my hat is and how crushed my shirts are. But you know what? This is a hat that I bought for 50 pesos, so like $3 on the way here, because I left my hat at home. I will be wearing that hat again. I am not going to be affected by commenters saying that my hat is too raggedy. By the way, the puppies did a number on that hat, so it's even more raggedy today than it was yesterday. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, that means that you need to push the subscribe button and watch more videos. Okay, let's go with some really basics as we shift gears here to talk about what the government wants you to do to live in Mexico. So when people move to Mexico or any other country, typically you can show up as a tourist and you get a certain amount of time that you can stay inside the country. And in Mexico, that's typically up to 6 months. And we'll talk more about that up to, which is an important couple of words. But you can become a temporary or a permanent resident, and then the step up from there is to become a citizen. And most people who are extranjeros or foreigners don't become citizens because you don't really get a lot for having Mexican citizenship compared to just having Mexican residency. But residency gives you the right to be in Mexico as often and for as long as you want. It's just like you're a citizen, but you don't have the right to vote. But let's talk about those financial requirements for residency. Now, if you follow Q RuPaul, you might have seen a recent video where he encouraged people to just go the tourist visa route if that was what works for you. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I think it is important to say, recognize Q RuPaul, ex-cop, completely legal to do that. However, maybe not the best idea. So we'll talk more about that later, but let's get into numbers now.
So when you come into any country, there are going to be some financial requirements for you to arrive. And it used to be that it was very inexpensive. It was very low rate of income that you had to be able to show to be able to come here. But because so many more people are coming here now, the Mexican government has increased those minimums, and they base it on the minimum wage. So the most recent president has actually raised the minimum wage here a couple of years in a row. And so now, to get in for a temporary residency, you have to have over $4,300 in your bank account or coming into your bank account every month for the last 6 months to be able to qualify for temporary residency. If you're talking permanent residency, it's even higher, over $6,000 a month.
So one other thing to note is that if you're a couple, if one of you can qualify, the other one can come in as a tourist, and then once the first one's a permanent resident, you can come over as a family. So there's some options there if there's more than just one of you watching this video. And the rules change all the time in Mexico. And so Kat and I are permanent residents, but now that is reserved for people who are actually retired. But temporary residency is not such a problem. You go through the process after 4 years, you can convert it to permanent residency. There's some actual benefits if you're on the mainland of being a temporary resident versus a permanent resident. But there are a lot of websites out there that have great information about this whole process because we're not really going into details. I'll have links down below, though. And there's a lot of websites that have really, really bad information about this. So let's chat with Sue about kind of what her experience has been browsing the web.
So if you're looking for information, one of the best places you can go is Nexperience. Their information is really current. It's been double and triple checked, and they've got legal staff on hand to make sure that their information is accurate. I went searching this past week, and I found one website that it quoted $1,600 of income a month would qualify you to get into Mexico. That is so out of date, it's not even funny. But people will believe it, and they'll go ahead and start making plans based on information that's inaccurate. So make sure that you've got a good source for your information.
So one other thing is that the consulates in the United States, probably Canada too, they're all different in terms of how they interpret what the minimum wage is. So another website, Mexico Relocation Guide, which is a sponsor of this video series, they have a really great page, and you'll find that down below, that tells you about the different consulates in 2024, what the minimums are at different consulates, because I think there's one in like Louisiana which is at least $1,000 less minimum per month of income compared to other consulates. And it has to do with, strange calculations based in, Mexican law. But they're not all the same. And some people, if you're really close, you're not going to make it in one place like Seattle, but you can make it somewhere else. It might be worth a plane ticket to be able to get your residency in Mexico and access all the things that we've been talking about that are so affordable. Once you have that residency, you're golden.
So far we've been talking about how much income you have to have every month to be able to get into Mexico. But there are other ways. You can look at a large bank deposit. If you've got a significant amount of money in savings or RSPs or something like that, you can use that as part of your qualification to get in. You can also look at buying a property, a fairly expensive property, but a serious property here in Mexico. If you have land ownership or property ownership here, that can make a big difference. If you've got a family member who lives here or are married to someone who lives here, all of those can get you criteria to get in. But if you're watching this video, you're probably looking for some of the less expensive ways to get in.
So that is actually the perfect segue into other ways. So say you're not going to meet those numbers that we've been talking about. You don't have the monthly income and you don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy property in Mexico. You're looking to get here on Social Security, which I think is, they say is average like $1,700 a month, but I think that's one of those weird things with averages being like higher than what most people actually get. So if you've got a lower income, let's talk about two ways that you could possibly get into Mexico and be here for the rest of your life. And the first one we're going to start with is what Hugh RuPaul recommended, which is the 6-month visa angle. And I'm just going to have Sue talk about maybe the pros and cons of going this way.
So when you come in on a flight into Mexico, you do get that 6-month tourist visa. And if you have to leave at that end of that 6 months, where are you going to have to fly to? And what is it going to cost you to fly in and out every time you need to leave? And you need to leave every 6 months. So that's one factor that you need to take into consideration. And you need to take into consideration if you do it many times and they start to recognize you, they can refuse to give you 6 months. They can choose to give you a shorter period of time unless you have, especially if you have a return ticket or don't have a return ticket. They can start questioning your motives. They can start questioning your purpose, how frequently you've been here, and check to see if you're trying to get around the rules around living in Mexico.
Yeah, and right now, 180 days is very typical. Even, on the land borders, things like that, getting a stamp in your passport that says you're here for 180 days, very typical. But 6 months to a year ago, not so typical. So you're counting on a system that could change. And so administrations change. Some are more friendly to foreigners. Some are less friendly to foreigners. So the ability to kind of go in and out on this tourist visa program, you're doing something a little bit risky, more risky than I would want to do when you're considering like moving somewhere for your retirement. You might have to move back to the United States where things are much more expensive and things might not, the numbers might not work out for you. So that is one option, though, is to go back and forth. If you're willing to kind of roll the dice, it's perfectly legal. But now let's look at number two. So this has to do with if you've traveled to Mexico in the past and you've overstayed your tourist visa. Mexico has a program for you. It's 2024 when we're making this video, early 2024. And that program, it's a possibility right now. I'm going to have Sue talk a little bit about that program, but this is all just surface level. If you're like, oh, I think I should, do that, go and find the details. Hire someone like Sue. Hire someone that really can get into the details of your situation and if that can really work for you. But we're just giving you some options out there.
So, as part of the whole COVID scenario, when so many people came down to Mexico to find a place where they could be isolated, where they could stay in a place that was less risky than it was in many places in the United States as far as COVID went, people came down here. And so there's now an amnesty program for people who came before 2022, before the end of COVID, who came on a tourist visa, and that tourist visa expired. And they weren't ready yet to go back at that point in time because it was still mid-COVID. And so they just let people stay. They didn't pursue anyone. They didn't cause any problems. Now they're saying if you came on that visa and you're here with an expired visa now and you would like to stay permanently, there is a program where it's called an amnesty program, where you can apply to the government to get residency status based on that amnesty. It costs about $900 US, and you can get your visitor's visa that you had that's expired converted into residency. And that's something you can consider.
Do you think that might work for you? Contact your immigration attorney. I know a lot of people who have taken this route. Some people who have purposely let their 180 days expire because it gives you access to like residency in Mexico without having to prove your income. So this is great for digital nomads and folks like that. So those are the two ways that you could kind of get around the financial requirements. So the Mexico Relocation Guide actually has a great webpage specifically about this transfer, turning your expired tourist visa into a residency visa. So there'll be a link down there below to their blog post. And if you decide to purchase the Mexico Relocation Guide, I'd love it if you use my link. That is how the sponsorship of this channel works. But now, say you're a person who's like, oh, I don't want to worry about getting across the border for every 6 months, and maybe that might change in the future. And I also have not been in Mexico yet, so I'm looking for a place to retire cheaper because, maybe you are on just a Social Security income, which is not going to go very far at all in the United States, and you're looking to move south of the border because of, as we talked about, those things are less expensive. But now you're realizing because of this video that it's not that simple. So let's talk about a couple other places that you could choose. So I did a little bit of research on the internet and found a couple of places that you could go to. And one of them was Nicaragua. And what I read on the internet, of course, as we talked about, don't believe everything you read on the internet, it was like $1,400 US a month is the amount of income you would need to move to Nicaragua. And also Panama was another option. Actually, this was something that came up with JP and Amelia. If you don't watch their YouTube channel, there'll be a link somewhere on the screen. They have some really great information, and they are comparing many other countries. And I think they live in Ecuador, so that is another option out there. But Panama, for a retiree, I want to say they needed you to show $1,000 of income, $1,000 US of income a month to be able to get residency down there. So let's have Sue give a couple of her thoughts on those two countries. There are countries in Asia, there are countries in Europe, there are lots of other options. It's just most people think of Mexico immediately because it is so convenient to the U.S. and it is so much less expensive. But as Sue mentioned, financial requirements have changed in the last couple of years. But let's hear her thoughts on Panama and Nicaragua.
So of those two places, you need to consider a few things. When I came here, we considered a number of things. Some of our biggest factors were language. Is the language going to be something that I can deal with? So Mexico, they speak Spanish. And in La Paz, there's a fair bit of English, but you still really do need to learn Spanish. So that's an important thing. If you're not ready to learn a language, Panama might be better for you because they do speak English there. A lot of English. Not so much in Nicaragua. Also, direct flights. The ability for people to come and visit you. If that's important to you, it was critically important to me. And so being able to fly directly into Cabo on a 4.5-hour flight from my hometown in Calgary was critical. What is it going to look like if they're flying to meet you in Nicaragua or if they're flying to meet you in Panama? What kinds of things do you need to consider when you're making a choice about where you want to live?
As you can see, the sun is starting to set a little bit behind me. The light is coming down, and we're coming close to the end of this video. But Kat and I have been in Panama and actually really enjoyed it. They use the U.S. dollar. That's another really big thing, is you don't have to worry about exchange rates and whatnot. It's convenient, but yeah, I'm not sure if that makes anything more expensive or less expensive. So a lot of people get confused when they start to do translations between pesos and dollars. But it's easy in Panama because that also their water is drinkable in most places in Panama. So another place to consider. If I mentioned it's $1,000 if you're a retiree, and I want to say it's like 3,200, 3,600, 3,300, something like that if you're a digital nomad. So they are discriminating a little bit based on age there. But this has been a wonderful video. There's the sun as it's going to set behind this building here. We have had a wonderful time. We still have a lot of our margaritas to go because they were really big margaritas and we've been talking with you the whole time. So what I'd like you to do next, though, is to enjoy another video. And you will actually, you know what? I don't want you to enjoy another video until you hear a little bit more about Sue and how she might help you move to La Paz.
So if you're coming to La Paz and you're looking for information about what it takes to live here, I'd be happy to help you. Once you get here, if you're needing help with setting up your services accounts, setting up a bank account, getting doctor's appointments, finding a doctor that speaks English, getting translations, help getting your services working when they're not working, any of those things that people who might not be familiar with the Spanish language might need help with, I'm here for you. So please contact me, suecasalapaz@gmail.com.
Well, thank you, Sue, for joining us. And if you want to contact Sue, that email address will be linked down below. Also linked below, if you found that you have some extra pesos in your pocket after this video, you could buy me a margarita at buymeamargarita.com. Kat and I would love that. Thank you so much. I've got some additional videos up here. One is sticking with the Canadian theme, a woman who is in Mexico on a very small pension from Canada. And the second person is someone who lost half their assets in a divorce right before they retired. Check out those two videos. Hasta luego.